For nearly 50 years, they were not supposed to exist. The Japanese government denied them. The official history ignored them. The women themselves were told to stay silent, and most of them did, because speaking meant reliving something that had no adequate words. Then, in 1991, one woman decided she had been silent long enough. And what she said when she finally spoke changed the historical record of World War II permanently. This is the story of the Comfort Women, who they were, what was done to them, and the decades-long fight to make the world acknowledge it. The Comfort Women system did not emerge spontaneously. It was constructed, administered, and expanded by the Japanese imperial military across more than a decade of war, beginning in the early 1930s and continuing until Japan's defeat in August 1945. The origins of the system trace to the Japanese military's occupation of Manchuria following the invasion of 1931, and more directly to the occupation of Nanjing in 1937. Following the atrocities committed by Japanese forces in Nanjing, a period of mass violence against Chinese civilians that shocked international observers, Japanese military commanders argued internally that organized military-run facilities would reduce random violence against civilian populations in occupied territories and limit the spread of disease among troops. The logic was clinical. The system it produced was not. The first comfort stations were established in Shanghai in 1932. As Japan's military operations expanded across China and eventually across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the network of comfort stations expanded with them. By the peak of the system's operation, facilities existed across China, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, and Pacific Island territories under Japanese control. Estimates of the total number of women held in this system range widely, partly because the records were systematically destroyed at the war's end. Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, who conducted the most comprehensive academic study of the available documentation, estimated the total number at between 50,000 and 200,000. The lower end of that range represents a conservative reading of fragmentary records. The higher end reflects the testimony of survivors and the scale of the military operations the system was designed to serve. The women who entered the system did so through processes that varied by nationality and geography, but shared a common feature: deception or coercion. In Korea, then a Japanese colony, young women were recruited through agents who offered what were described as factory jobs, nursing positions, or domestic work in Japan. Families in poor rural communities who had no reason to distrust official-seeming recruiters and no access to information that might have allowed them to understand what was actually being offered agreed to arrangements that removed their daughters from home on false pretenses. In China and Southeast Asia, the methods were often more direct. Women were taken from their homes or from the streets of occupied cities. In the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, European and local women were removed from civilian internment camps or from villages and brought to comfort stations. Once inside the system, a woman had no mechanism for leaving it. The stations were operated under military authority. The women were assigned numbers, given Japanese names in many cases, and held in facilities attached to or near military installations. They were required to be available to serve soldiers throughout the day, and on a schedule that was, by every account given by survivors, relentless in its demands. The administrative structure of the system was documented in military records that, contrary to the Japanese government's later claims, had not been entirely destroyed. When historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi discovered a set of documents in the archives of Japan's defense agency in 1992, documents that had been sitting in an accessible archive for nearly 50 years, they established beyond any serious academic dispute that the Imperial Japanese military had been directly involved in the organization and operation of the Comfort Women system at an official level. Those documents and their 1992 discovery became a turning point in the historical debate about what the Japanese government had known and authorized. The women inside the system were, in the military's administrative language, categorized as a service resource. The language of the official documents was bureaucratic, technical, and entirely stripped of any acknowledgement that the people being described were human beings who had been placed in the system through force or fraud. That language, preserved in the documents Yoshimi found, told its own story about the institutional mind that had built and maintained the system for over a decade. What life inside those facilities actually looked like, day to day, from the perspective of the women held in them, required a different kind of source, and that source came eventually from the survivors themselves. The physical conditions of comfort stations varied across different theaters of the war and across different periods of its duration, but the accounts given by survivors who eventually testified described certain features that were consistent across different locations and different years. The stations were typically small structures divided into individual rooms or cubicles, built or requisitioned near military installations. The rooms were minimal. In some accounts, there was a cot and a basin. In others, there was a mat on the floor. The women were given basic necessities and were expected to be presentable for soldiers at all hours of operation. The daily schedule was determined by the military's operational tempo. During periods when units were stationary and not engaged in active combat, the demand was continuous. Accounts from survivors described days during which they had no effective rest, a reality that produced rapid physical deterioration, persistent illness, and psychological damage that many of them carried for the rest of their lives. Soldiers paid a small fee at the station entrance, and the women received a nominal portion of that fee, a structure that the Japanese military used in its documentation to characterize the arrangement as voluntary employment. The reality that the women had not agreed to this employment, that they had been brought there through deception or force, that they could not leave, and that refusal carried severe consequences, was not reflected in the administrative language of the fee structure. That language was the official fiction. The lived experience was something else entirely. Korean survivor Lee Ok-seon, who was taken at the age of 14 and held in stations in China for years, gave testimony in interviews and legal proceedings that described the specific weight of that daily experience, the absence of any future to plan for, the complete severance from family and home, the physical and psychological damage that accumulated without any prospect of ending. Illness was pervasive inside the stations. Sexually transmitted infections spread through the facilities despite the Japanese military's periodic distribution of preventive measures. Measures that were, in any case, used inconsistently and for the protection of soldiers rather than for the welfare of the women. When women became seriously ill, the treatment they received varied from minimal to none. Women who died inside the system were, in some documented cases, disposed of without any notification to their families. They simply vanished, and their families had no way of knowing whether they were alive or dead. The geographic movement of the system created its own dimension of suffering. As the Japanese military advanced or retreated, comfort women were moved with the units they served. Women taken from Korea found themselves in China, then further into Southeast Asia, then potentially into Pacific Island territories as the war expanded. Each move took them further from home, further from any possibility of family contact, and deeper into a geography that became increasingly dangerous as Allied forces began their advance. In the final stages of the war, as Japanese positions collapsed across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the comfort women in those areas faced the danger of the combat itself. Some were killed in the fighting, some were abandoned by retreating Japanese forces, left in territories where they did not speak the language and had no resources. Some were held by Japanese forces until the literal moment of surrender, and then abandoned in the chaos that followed. When the war ended in August 1945, and the surviving women were finally free to leave the stations, many of them faced the realization that freedom did not solve the problems that the preceding years had created. They were in foreign countries, they had no money, they had no documentation, they could not easily contact their families, and they were carrying the knowledge of what they had endured into societies that had no framework for receiving it. The journey from the comfort stations to something recognizable as a normal life was, for many survivors, longer and more damaging than the war years themselves. The women who made it home, and not all of them did, returned to communities that were, in many cases, unprepared and unwilling to absorb what they brought with them. In Korea, the cultural weight of what had happened created a specific and painful dynamic. Korean society in the post-war period placed enormous value on concepts of family honor and female virtue that made the experience of the comfort women impossible to discuss without consequences. Women who had been taken through no choice of their own, who had survived conditions that would have broken most people, returned home to find that their own communities could not absorb the reality of what they had been through. Many of them said nothing. They did not tell their families. They did not tell their husbands, many of whom never knew. They constructed lives around a silence that sat at the center of everything, shaping decisions about where to live, whether to marry, whether to have children, and who to trust with any piece of the truth. Some women who had been taken in their early teens returned home to find that the years they had lost had made normal adulthood difficult in ways that compounded the original damage. They had missed the years in which education, social formation, and the development of a future had been possible. They came back to communities that had moved forward without them, into lives that had to be built from whatever was left after the war had finished with them. The physical legacy was, for many, severe. The conditions inside the comfort stations produced lasting health consequences, gynecological damage, chronic infections, and in a significant number of documented cases, the loss of the ability to have children. This dimension of the survivors' experience, documented in medical studies conducted decades after the war, added a biological permanence to the damage that had been done. The psychological dimension was equally lasting. What later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was not a concept available to the women who came home in 1945 and 1946. There was no clinical framework for what they were carrying. There were no treatment programs. There was no social recognition of what they had experienced as an injury that deserved care and acknowledgement. There was only the silence, the expectation that what had happened would be absorbed privately, without complaint and without disclosure. For decades, the vast majority of the women who had been in the comfort system maintained that silence. They were helped in this by the structure of post-war politics. Japan and South Korea normalized diplomatic relations in 1965 through a treaty that included financial settlements and was interpreted by the Japanese government as resolving all wartime claims between the two countries. The specific experience of the comfort women was not addressed in those negotiations. The women were not consulted. Their existence as a category of war victim was not acknowledged in the treaty language. The South Korean government, for its part, was focused on economic development and the management of its relationship with Japan as a strategic and economic partner. Raising the comfort women issue would have complicated that relationship, and for years the South Korean government did not raise it. The silence held for nearly 50 years, and then, in 1991, it broke. Kim Hak-sun was born in 1924 in Manchuria and grew up in Korea. She was 17 years old when she was taken and brought to a comfort station in China in 1941. She survived. She came home. She built a life around the silence that the post-war years demanded. For 46 years, she said nothing publicly about what had happened to her. She was not unique in this. The vast majority of surviving comfort women had maintained the same silence for the same period. The reasons were the same: social stigma, family considerations, the absence of any institutional channel through which speaking would produce anything other than personal harm. In 1990, a South Korean women's organization, the Korean Council for Women, drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan, was established specifically to advocate for the comfort women and to push the issue onto the political agenda. The organization's work began creating, for the first time, a public space in which the subject could be discussed. Japanese government officials, questioned about the comfort women in 1990, responded by stating that the women had been civilian contractors who had participated voluntarily, a statement so disconnected from what survivors knew to be true that it became, for some of them, the provocation that outweighed decades of protective silence. On August 14, 1991, Kim Hak-sun gave a press conference in Seoul. She was the first comfort woman to publicly identify herself and give testimony about her experience. She was 67 years old. She described what had been done to her during the war with a directness and specificity that could not be dismissed as vague allegation. She named the mechanism, the deception, the transport, the station, the conditions, the years, in terms that matched the accounts that other survivors, once the silence had been broken by her example, would go on to corroborate. The impact of her testimony was immediate and lasting. Within months, more than 200 other Korean women came forward to identify themselves as survivors. The testimony they gave, individually and collectively, formed the foundation of a historical record that the Japanese government's position, that the Comfort Women system had been voluntary and civilian-run, could not survive contact with. Kim Hak-sun subsequently filed suit in Tokyo District Court, along with 2 other survivors, demanding a formal apology and compensation from the Japanese government. The suit was one of multiple legal actions filed by survivors in Japanese courts across the 1990s. The legal proceedings moved slowly, produced limited direct relief for the plaintiffs, and ultimately did not compel the Japanese government to provide the formal state apology that the survivors and their advocates had sought. But Kim Hak-sun's 1991 decision to speak transformed what had been a suppressed historical episode into one of the most significant and contested diplomatic and human rights issues in East Asia. She died in 1997 without receiving the apology she had spent the last years of her life pursuing. The movement she had helped catalyze continued without her. In January 1992, less than 6 months after Kim Hak-sun's testimony, Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi walked into the library of Japan's defense agency and found, in an accessible archive that had apparently been left unreviewed since the war, a set of documents bearing the official markings of the Japanese Imperial Army. The documents were related to the Comfort Women system. They demonstrated direct military involvement in the organization and operation of the stations at an official level. Yoshimi brought the documents to the newspaper Asahi Shimbun, which published the findings on January 11, 1992. The day before Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa was scheduled to visit South Korea. The timing could not have been more precisely damaging to the Japanese government's position. Miyazawa issued an apology during his visit and announced that the government would conduct an official investigation. The investigation produced the Kono Statement of August 1993, issued by Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono. The Kono Statement acknowledged that comfort stations had been established and operated in response to requests from the military, that Japanese military and government personnel had been directly involved in managing the stations, and that many women had been recruited against their will through coercion and deception. It expressed what it described as sincere apologies and remorse to the women who had suffered. The Kono Statement was significant. It represented the most direct official acknowledgement that the Japanese government had produced. But it also fell short, in several ways, of what survivors and the South Korean government had sought. It was a cabinet secretary's statement, not a formal act of the Japanese parliament. It did not carry the legal weight of a Diet resolution. It did not include a commitment to individual compensation. And in the years that followed its issuance, successive Japanese governments complicated its legacy by making statements that appeared to question aspects of what the Kono Statement had acknowledged. In 1995, the Japanese government established the Asian Women's Fund, a mechanism through which compensation could be paid to survivors using private donations, supplemented by government funds for medical and welfare services. The fund was rejected by the South Korean government and by many survivors as inadequate. The criticism centered on the use of private rather than state funds, which the survivors' advocates argued was a way of providing money without accepting full legal state responsibility. Many Korean survivors refused to accept payments from the fund on the grounds that doing so would be interpreted as accepting a settlement that fell short of genuine accountability. The fund operated until 2007, having distributed atonement money to some survivors in the Philippines, the Netherlands, South Korea, and Taiwan. The question of whether the payments represented adequate acknowledgement of what had been done remained unresolved. The political dimension of the issue became increasingly turbulent through the 2000s and 2010s. Japanese politicians and public figures periodically made statements that survivors and their advocates characterized as minimizing or denying what had happened. Some Japanese nationalist commentators argued that the Kono Statement had overstated the military's coercive role. The debate over historical interpretation, combined with the formal diplomatic disagreement between Japan and South Korea, created a pattern in which the issue repeatedly surged into diplomatic prominence and then receded without resolution. The women at the center of the issue were growing older. Survivors who had been in their late teens or 20s during the war were in their 70s and 80s by the time the political debate reached its most visible phase. Every year that passed without a resolution meant that more of the women who had actual memory of what had happened would not live to see an outcome. On January 8, 1992, the day before Yoshimi's documents were published in Asahi Shimbun, and while the story was already beginning to move through Korean civil society, a small group of women gathered outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. They were there to demand an apology. Their demonstration was the first of what became a weekly fixture in Korean public life, a gathering held every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy that has continued without interruption into the present day. The Wednesday demonstrations became one of the longest-running regular protest events in modern history. Week after week, year after year, the participants gathered, the surviving women when they were able, younger advocates who had taken up the cause, school children brought by teachers, ordinary Seoul residents who wanted to be present. A statue of a young girl sitting in a chair, her feet not quite reaching the ground, was installed across from the embassy in December 2011 on the 20th anniversary of the demonstrations. The statue became a symbol of the movement and generated its own diplomatic controversy. The Japanese government repeatedly requested its removal, requests that the South Korean government declined to honor. The survivors who participated in the demonstrations aged visibly over the decades. Women who had been vigorous in their 70s became frail in their 90s. Some died before they could see any resolution. The gap between what they had sought and what the political process had produced grew more painful as their numbers fell. In December 2015, the governments of Japan and South Korea announced what was described as a final and irreversible agreement on the comfort women issue. Japan offered an apology from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, expressed through the South Korean foreign minister, and committed approximately 1 billion yen, roughly $8.3 million, to a new foundation established to support surviving victims. The South Korean government agreed that it would consider the issue resolved and would not raise it again in official bilateral contexts. The reaction among survivors and advocates was sharply negative. The Korean Council, which had been at the center of the advocacy movement since its founding, rejected the agreement. Survivors who were still alive stated that they had not been consulted during the negotiations and that the terms did not reflect what they had been seeking. The criticism focused on the same points that had made the 1995 Asian Women's Fund unacceptable. The apology had been delivered indirectly rather than in a formal parliamentary acknowledgement, and the legal question of state responsibility had not been resolved in terms the survivors found adequate. The 2015 agreement collapsed as a political settlement under the subsequent South Korean government of Moon Jae-in, which came to power in 2017 and announced that the agreement had not adequately reflected the victims' perspectives. The foundation established under the agreement was dissolved. Japan characterized the dissolution as a breach of the agreement's terms. The diplomatic wound reopened. By the early 2020s, the number of registered survivors in South Korea had fallen below 20. Women who had been teenagers during the war were in their 90s or had died. The issue they had brought into public consciousness 30 years earlier remained unresolved at the level of formal diplomatic acknowledgement. The comfort women issue involved women from multiple countries: Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, the Netherlands, Taiwan, and others. And the experience of survivors from different national backgrounds had distinct dimensions, shaped by the specific circumstances of how they had been brought into the system and what post-war conditions they had returned to. Dutch and Eurasian women, taken from civilian internment camps in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, were citizens of a European colonial power, and their cases were addressed, however inadequately, in the post-war military tribunals that dealt with Japanese war crimes in that theater. The Batavia trials of 1948 prosecuted a small number of Japanese officers for the forced conscription of Dutch women into comfort stations in Java. It was the only post-war proceeding that specifically addressed the comfort women issue in judicial terms, and it covered only a narrow subset of the broader system. Filipino survivors, organized through an advocacy group called Lila Pilipina, gave extensive testimony that was documented by journalists and researchers from the 1990s onward. The Philippines' experience of the comfort women system was distinct in that the country had also suffered the Bataan Death March and the Manila Massacre, and the comfort women issue existed alongside a broader catalog of documented Japanese military violence against Filipino civilians that had its own unresolved political dimensions. Chinese survivors faced the particular difficulty that the post-war political environment including the division of China between the People's Republic and Taiwan, and the complex relationship between both Chinese governments and Japan, made sustained advocacy on the comfort women issue more complicated than in South Korea, where a democratizing civil society created the conditions in which advocacy organizations could operate and amplify survivor voices. The academic and legal record assembled since 1991 established beyond serious historical dispute that the comfort women system had been real, had been operated under military authority, had involved hundreds of thousands of women across a decade and a half of operation, and had produced suffering that lasted for the lifetimes of the women who survived it. What the record also documents is the decades of political and diplomatic effort that produced at most partial acknowledgement and no final resolution acceptable to the survivors. The women who came forward, who broke a silence they had maintained for decades, who stood in front of cameras and gave testimony about experiences they had been told to keep hidden, who filed suits in Japanese courts and traveled to give evidence at international forums, did so in full knowledge that they were very likely not going to live to see the outcome they sought. Kim Hak-sun died in 1997. Lee Yong-soo, who became one of the most internationally visible advocates among surviving Korean comfort women, testified before the United States House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee in February 2007, helping build the case for House Resolution 121, which called on Japan to formally acknowledge and apologize for the comfort women system. That resolution passed the House in July 2007. Lee was still giving testimony and attending the Wednesday demonstrations decades later, in her 90s. The Wednesday demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul have been held every week since January 1992. As of 2025, they have continued without interruption for more than 30 years. The young girl in the statue across from the embassy still sits with her feet not quite reaching the ground. The women who set those demonstrations in motion waited most of their lives for an acknowledgement that has not, in the terms they sought, arrived. What they produced instead was a historical record that cannot be erased, a documentation of what was done, who did it, and what it cost the people it was done to. That record now belongs to history in a way that no political settlement or diplomatic agreement can alter. It is there, in the documents and the testimony and the decades of advocacy for anyone willing to read it honestly. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.